Hello and welcome back to Susanne Kurz Coaching and Media. Death and Beyond, Part 8. Well, this video doesn't really fit the title of the series because we are not going to talk about death and what comes after death, but rather what comes before death, phenomena before death. And we already had that when we were talking about deathbed visions. And today I just want to tell you 4 interesting stories about cases of terminal mental clarity, something I have learned from a German book. And these cases, which I want to tell you about, are from this book by a biologist, Michael Nahm, German book. And the title of the book is When the Darkness Finds Its End, Terminal Mental Clarity and Other Phenomena. So that's what I want to talk about today. And then we can discuss potential explanations for it the next time. Let's just start with the first surprising case. Some of these cases, by the way, are compiled from literature from the 19th and 20th century and also from the 18th century, I think sometimes, but that's the older cases, but also cases which he has been told about personally, which have been reported to him personally or are from our century. So the 21st century. The book itself has been published in 2012, so that's over 10 years ago, but I read it when it was fresh and new. Obviously, I found that very exciting, and I think there's not really that much research that has happened since then, but I may be wrong. If you know something about it, let me know. But I want to start with the first surprising case of a woman who had chronic meningitis, and she essentially got situations when she felt dizzy and lost consciousness, and then she also got very confused, so she couldn't remember her age. She said she was over 20 years younger than she actually was. She couldn't remember that she had children. She thought her mother had died at a time when she herself hadn't even been born, and things like that. So she couldn't remember her own life, her own past, her own present. She couldn't understand her circumstances, and all that got worse. And in the end, she actually was unconscious or completely confused and unable to communicate for 4 months before her death. And shortly before her death, then she suddenly was able to communicate again and was completely mentally clear. She understood where she was and her environment and everything. She could remember everything correctly. So everything was back, and she could communicate and all that. And then she died. Now, the really interesting thing here is they did an autopsy afterwards and looked at her brain, how it looked, and her brain was in a really bad state. She had the chronic meningitis, and also there was some part of her bone sticking in her brain, and the brain was more voluminous than it should be and had water enclosures and had blisters and all that sort of stuff. And the physician who did the autopsy and also had treated her said that or noted down that this state of her brain actually was one that couldn't account for how she was able to become clear again and communicate and remember everything correctly, because it usually, if you see this state of the brain, it would mean that she couldn't do any of that, and so that means the brain didn't look like there was some biological regeneration taking place towards the end. So that would have allowed her to get back to clarity and have all these faculties working again. So that wasn't the case. The brain didn't look like there had been any regeneration in place. And so that's interesting, because that begs the question, if the brain essentially produces all that, our ability to think clearly, our memory and our consciousness and all that, then how could this woman with this brain be able to become mentally clear again, communicate and remember and understand everything, if her brain was in a state where she shouldn't have been able to do that, frankly. So that's the first very interesting case. The second case is the case of a woman who was suffering from Alzheimer's disease. And with Alzheimer's disease, the thing is that the brain is getting, damaged and cells are dying. So their substance that actually dies and isn't there anymore. So if the faculties and abilities that go away while this disease is progressing are located in these areas of the brain that have died or are bound to them in some way or are produced by them, then when they have died and then they have been destroyed and can't be retrieved somehow, then it shouldn't be possible to regain any of those faculties or abilities, right? So this woman who had Alzheimer's disease had already been completely, unable to communicate or react or understand anything for 2 years. She was just lying there and staring at the ceiling. And then she had a heart attack and was revived. And after this revival, she suddenly was mentally clear again and could communicate. And she actually talked to her children and to the physicians and to the nurses and everyone, and thanked her children for regularly visiting her, even though she was unable to react to them or communicate with them. And she thanked the people in the hospital, the doctors, the nurses, everyone, for how they had treated her. And it was very clear that she remembered all of the things that had happened around her and the people that had been there during these past 2 years when she hadn't been there, essentially. From the outside, it looked like she hadn't been there, She couldn't react, she couldn't communicate, so it looked like she couldn't take anything in. That's also very interesting, especially if it is the case that Alzheimer's disease destroys the brain. So that's another very interesting case, which is surprising if everything is produced by our brains, right? By the way, this patient, this woman, then had a heart attack in the following night and died of it. So she had been mentally clear, just a couple of hours before her death. So that was very close to it. Now, the third very interesting case is that of a woman who, after a fever, somehow just went into a delirium, and she developed delusional ideas and had fits of rage and all that. So they needed to restrain her, and it stayed like that, and she just wasn't able to remember what had happened in her life before, and she couldn't understand the environment and circumstances she was in, and she only recognized the 2 closest people who were taking care of her and nobody else anymore. And that stayed like this for 3 years. And then, some 3 weeks before her death, she slowly became clearer and regained her mental clarity and understood her environment she was in, her circumstances, and was able to communicate clearly and to remember everything. And she also talked about the situation she had been in before, and it was clear that she remembered a good deal of what had happened in the time when she had been confused and delusional and essentially not recognized anyone except for the two closest people and all that. So that's also an interesting story. And even more interesting is that they then, after her death, once again did an autopsy and found that her brain looked very strange. The outer part of it was grown together with the bone of her skull, essentially. And when they opened the skull, then the brain came out, so it was very swollen up, and it was also much softer than it should be. So the brain was clearly not in its usual shape and form and had some damage. It's not clear exactly what it was. Nam puts it into the chapter of tumors, but he says himself it's not clear that there was a tumor. It's just because of this abnormality of her brain that he put it there, because it's not clear what it was, because that's one of the older cases, obviously, which he took from literature. But the fourth case, which is really interesting, is more recent, and that's the case of a man who had lung cancer, and that had spread to his brain, and the tumors in his brain then had not only pushed the normal brain structures aside, but had actually destroyed a good deal of them, because they did tests and looked at it and actually found that there was very little healthy brain substance left. And he also then lost his ability to move and couldn't speak properly anymore. And 2 weeks before his death, that got worse, and essentially in the end he couldn't move and he was in a comatose state and couldn't communicate, couldn't speak at all, which is clear if the brain is being destroyed more and more. But he also, shortly before his death, then was able to come back again, regained mental clarity, and talked for 5 minutes straight with his relatives clearly and normally, and then he died. So this is also another case where the state of the brain actually shouldn't have allowed him to do that, to come back to speaking and thinking clearly and communicating clearly and all that. So that's also a very interesting case. And I think all these cases at least put a question mark on the assumption that all our mental faculties and our consciousness and our memories are produced by and somehow stored in the brain, and if the brain gets destroyed, then all of that evaporates. Because in these cases, obviously, it's hard to explain then how these people would have been able to come back to mental clarity at the times they did. So obviously, that's a big discussion. And Michael Nahm in his book actually does that. He discusses explanations, potential explanations for that. And that's a whole chapter. And I won't go into that today. That's for the next video, but I'll bring you that. Hope you enjoyed the video and hope to see you soon again. Have a good time. Until then. Bye for now.